So we're sitting here hand-wringing all session. I even promised, if you'll recall, I promised to go to church. I promised I'd go to one church service if Bob Ferguson vetoed rent control. So here I am all session long thinking this guy promised on the campaign trail that he was going to build hundreds of thousands of additional units during his first term of affordable housing and of workforce housing. So certainly he can't support rent control because that would totally cut him off at the knees and he wouldn't be able to accomplish this massive campaign promise that he made. Only to find out that all along, the whole session debate over it, Governor Ferguson has behind the scenes supported rent control. He just didn't want to say it publicly. That's according to the Washington State Standard. The headline behind the scenes, Ferguson backed the bill to cap rent increases for months. The governor finally voiced support publicly for the legislation on Wednesday after a lawmaker shared information about his views. So basically what happened, and this is really interesting, there's a lot of back and forth we can talk about here because there's some political undercurrents that are important to know. So there's a state lawmaker named Yasmin Trudeau, and she's a progressive, like far left wing, and she wants to run for governor. I know she does. So she is, and it's very blatant in this story. I'm not going to get into all of that, but she's chiding Bob Ferguson in this story with the Standard, basically saying it would be nice if he stood up for working class people and made his support of this known publicly. Instead, he just tells us he supports it behind the scenes and then doesn't come out vocally and support it as we're fighting these hard fought battles. So she's just setting herself up for a primary challenge, which she won't even get 10% in a primary challenge against Bob Ferguson. But I digress. So she told the State Standard, it said, State Representative Yasmin Trudeau, one of the chief architects of legislation to cap rent hikes across Washington, says Governor Bob Ferguson's team has made clear to lawmakers since the second week of the legislative session back in January that he supports the measure. Just absolutely unbelievable. So why didn't he say anything? The governor's communications director, Brianna Aho, said in a statement that the governor's office has a process to, quote, thoroughly review bills after they pass. The governor has rarely offered public comment on bills prior to the completion of that process. Aho said, the governor is supportive of the policy, but we need to complete our process before he offers further comment, she said of the rent bill. Okay. Gotcha. Cool. To me, that's him, again, playing both sides. That's him acting like a moderate, doesn't want to come out and say he supports rent control, whispers to the Democrats, I support rent control behind the scenes. And then he's going to pretend that he's doing a thorough review of it when he supported it all along since week 2, and then he's going to sign it into law. Absolutely insane. So meanwhile, as that's happening, so rent control is going to be law statewide in Washington. It's going to be disastrous. Absolutely insane. And we know it's going to be disastrous, not because it's a guess. Not because I think it'll be disastrous and someone else might have a very reasonable argument for why it's not going to be disastrous. No, there is no reasonable fact-based argument for rent control, that it won't ultimately hurt renters. Why? Because it has in every place it's ever been tried, including, as we speak, in New York City. So just like in San Francisco, New York City essentially has a board that deals with rent control and sets the caps for rent increases. And right now, according to the New York Post, the caps they've set for rent increases are outpacing or are lower than the costs. So the costs for landlords through inflation, like increased energy costs, all of these other costs added for landlords, are higher than the allowed rent increases by the board in New York City. So the New York Post, this is the headline, Stiffing Landlords is Killing New York City's Housing Market. The Rent Guidelines Board last week took yet another step toward crushing the city's housing market by capping rent hikes below landlord costs. So what they're looking to cap it at for this year is about 1.75% to 4.75% for a one-year lease and 4.75% to 7.75% for two-year renewals. So actually that 7.75% number is pretty similar to what Washington State is about to put into place. So they give an example here by the numbers. Again, nobody's making this up. This is just by the numbers. It's just a fact. From 2013 to 2023, costs for pre-1974 buildings outside the Manhattan core, which is where most rent-stabilized units are located, skyrocketed to 37%. Yet the board only let rents go up less than 25%. So explain to me how anyone is supposed to be a landlord in New York City. Explain to me why anyone would want to be a landlord in New York City. If your costs go up 37% and over that period of time, you're only allowed to raise rents 25%. So are we just supposed to say landlords should be resigned to losing money, to owning these units as like a charitable cause? So of course, what happens, as the New York Post points out, landlords who can't keep up with costs wind up having to sell to more unsavory characters or skimping on maintenance, and tenants suffer either way. Or owners will simply go bust, losing their buildings to banks or to the city for failing to pay taxes as they did during the 1970s and 1980s. So the end result is fewer affordable units, not controlled rent, not predictability for tenants. And a few people might benefit early on, but over the long haul, in the long run, it is going to wreak havoc on housing in Washington state even further, just like it has everywhere else. So the idea that we would come up with the same policy that other places have already put into effect that hasn't worked, and for some reason it would work here, is just asinine. It's done to appease a segment of the Democratic base and to say, oh, we're fighting for you, when really the policy kind of fights against them. And, you know, if you wanted to go in there and cap rents at like 20%, or this is the example they always use, right? Democrats will use an example. I talked to a constituent and their rent went up 50% in 1 year. Is that happening? Gosh, maybe. I mean, that kind of sucks. Like, I'm not even in favor of that. That's kind of a shitty thing to do. But is that happening across the board? No. Did they find, they probably made it up, first of all. I'm going to guess they made it up. But did they find the one worst case, one-off situation? And then they use that as an excuse to cap rent increases at 7%. Okay, you're saying predatory is like, oh, 30, 40, 50% increases in a single year, but you want to cap it at 7%, which their costs are some years going to exceed that. So they use these extreme examples, but then they set rent caps at a very low rate that are going to hurt a bunch of landlords, not just landlords in those most extreme cases that, again, I think they probably made up. So I don't know what Bob Ferguson is thinking. You cannot be a moderate. You cannot be a responsible. You can't even be very smart, which I know he's a smart guy. I know he's a smart guy. I don't think that's in dispute. There's nothing smart about rent control. There's nothing smart about promising people you're going to build hundreds of thousands of dollars or hundreds of thousands of additional units of housing and then signing off on a policy that's going to make that impossible. So for such a smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do. And I'm also thoroughly annoyed that you made me hope and wish and think there might be a chance that you'd veto rent control when you were telling the Democrats behind the scenes all along that you were going to pass it. Absolutely ridiculous. Our weekly housing segment is brought to you by our friends at the Rental Housing Association, we are proud to fight alongside, trying to defeat some of these asinine policies like rent control. If you are a small to mid-sized landlord in Washington state, become a member of RHA today, rhawa.org, rhawa.org. They are fighting back, trying to protect you from these crazy, crazy policies.